I want to say two things very quickly. There was some comment made earlier this morning about people not wanting to live in integrated communities or whatever. I just want to mention that Erase Racism did some survey research with the Stony Brook Survey Research Center making the phone calls for us. And only 1% of the folks said that they would prefer, if given their choice, they would prefer 100% African American community. These were questions posed to African Americans. Only 1% said they wanted 100% community of African Americans. 69% said they really would like kind of a 50-50 situation, and all the other ones wanted some level of a racial integration in the community where they were living. So that was one thing I wanted to just clear up, at least for Long Island. And then the other thing is this issue of access to high quality, so-called high quality public schools, and we understand right away that there are problems with the measurements in terms of test scores and whatever else, but that's kind of what we have, a variety of measurements like that. So for African Americans on Long Island, only 2.7% of African Americans have access to those schools based on where they live, okay, because of housing segregation. And for Latinos, it's 4.5%. This is compared to 28% for whites and 30% for Asians. So that's the highest quality, highest performing schools as measured with those usual kinds of measurements. And it's based on just where they live. So they pop out of their moms, and this is where they get to have access to go to school. So we need to keep those things in mind. So we're going to scoot right along here. Our first speaker this afternoon is Susan Eaton.
So I'm going to talk today about some of the work that I'm doing through a project that I started a little less than 3 years ago with a colleague named Gina Turchino. It's called One Nation Indivisible. And we look out across our vast nation here, and we identify and then tell stories through a variety of different media, through written narratives, through videos, through audio slideshows, photography, about people who are out there creating and sustaining racially diverse schools, culturally diverse schools, linguistically, economically diverse schools, and people who are also trying to drastically improve, make those diverse schools more equitable within the schools. The second part of our work, besides this communications part, is to connect the people who are doing this work on the ground, both to each other and to a national network of policy advocates and scholars, so that the folks who are on the ground doing this really challenging and also really rewarding work can have the national audiences and the national forums that we think that they deserve. So I'm going to talk about efforts very quickly. Maryland may get the short shrift here, the Baltimore Oriole, given the time limitations. And I chose to represent these states and these efforts by birds, because first of all, because I don't like flags, because flags usually represent a geographically bounded area, whereas a bird, you can't really locally control a bird unless you put it in a cage, and these birds aren't in cages, so there you go. So we're going to talk about Connecticut, and we're going to talk about the greater Hartford area. So that's the city of Hartford and about maybe 30 or so suburbs around it. We're going to talk about efforts in a couple of former farming, former rural, and now definitely rapidly developing suburban and changing communities in Utah. And then we might be able to talk about Maryland, Montgomery County. So we'll start with Connecticut, and I have my notes here. I'm sorry, this is the first time I've given this particular presentation. Just a little bit of context about Connecticut. It's one of our wealthiest states. It's one of our most unequal states in terms of income. It's also highly racially segregated, and like Nassau County we saw today, it's also very fragmented. It's got a lot of very small school districts. It's got a handful of very large, very high poverty urban districts surrounded by changing inner ring suburbs and mostly white affluent suburbs as well. It's also a state that clings very strongly to local control. Story in Connecticut, we're going to start in 1989. And I know there's one of these pointers. I'm going to see one of those pointers. Oh, look at this. That starts in 1989. A group of Local and national civil rights lawyers filed a case. This is one of the civil rights lawyers, John Britton, who I have him up there because I know a lot of you in the audience have taken part in various subversive activities that have involved him as well. So there's your friend. And it was filed on behalf of 13 families. The lead plaintiff is this woman here, Elizabeth Sheff, and her son Milo, who at the time was in 3rd grade. And I'm really glad that Michael Rebell talked this morning about Milliken, because Sheff was really, it was a state-based case, and it was designed originally to be a route around Milliken. And then it wasn't brought in federal courts where most civil rights cases were, it was brought in state court. And the basic argument of Sheff was that the racial segregation within the city of Hartford denied students an unequal educational opportunity, which was guaranteed by the state constitution. We're gonna fly like a bird 10 years later, to the decision in 1996 in which the state's highest court essentially agreed with the plaintiffs and in their 4-3 decision said that the school boundary lines that separated Hartford from its suburbs were unconstitutional. So that was a big deal. Let's see. So at the time, it wasn't clear. One thing was clear because of the state's sort of long-time allegiance to local control, that this was going to be a voluntary plan, that there wasn't going to be any sort of, quote, mandatory busing, that this was going to be based on, whatever the remedy was going to be placed on voluntary measures. At the time, a lot of people were doubtful that this was going to work. Even some of the strongest supporters of the Sheff v. O'Neill case did not think that suburban parents especially would leave their suburban schools and choose to go to school in the city of Hartford. Nonetheless, even at the time, the education commissioner at the time said, quote, people are happy in their neighborhood schools. What we found out as the remedy progressed and as a system of popular interdistrict magnet schools, most of which were placed in the city of Hartford, developed, and a transfer program expanded that allowed students from the city to attend one of, I think it's now 28 suburban districts, grew in popularity, was that people were not happy in their suburban schools. Suburban people weren't happy, and urban people weren't necessarily happy. When they were given opportunities to attend high-quality, specialized, very innovative, high-performing, well-functioning, and extremely racially and culturally and linguistically diverse schools in the city of Hartford. Another thing happened after this remedy took root in the metropolitan region. People really liked the schools. People came to value and identify the schools. And what happened was one of these rare and difficult to establish multiracial, multi-generational, urban-suburban coalitions of people who became advocates for the diverse schools in the city of Hartford. The Sheff movement. The Sheff movement was really important in testifying before the legislature, making sure that this remedy stayed strong, that these schools stayed strong. But the other important thing that they did was they made sure that there was 5 minutes left. We're not going to talk about Maryland. I'm really sorry. I know you're crushed. That they provided information. They made sure that the information was equally distributed across among poor families, among Latino families, among black families, and white families, and that has really made all the difference. The lawyers were important, remaining advocates, but what really has made the difference, I think, to a large degree in the city of Hartford is this movement. So what do we have now? I can't really read that because I'm kind of blindish. 17,000 students in 45 interdistrict magnet schools, about 2,200 students in a transfer program. 21 of the schools are operated by a regional organization named CREC. 41% of Hartford students now attend school in desegregated settings, which is like compared to 3% or something when I started doing research there. As measured by test scores, which aren't everything, and graduation rates, students in the regional magnets and in the transfer program of all races tend to outperform their counterparts. Quickly, we're going to go to Utah, because I know everybody is interested in Utah. Some context about Utah. As you probably know, Utah is a red state, a very red state. And until 2000, it was really one of our most heavily white states. After the early 2000s, Utah began to change because of immigration, and it is now 13% Latino. It was a very rapid change. If you look here on the right, in 2006, if you remember, there were immigrant rights marches all across the country. No one was more surprised by the huge turnout. People were surprised about turnouts in a lot of places, but no no more than Salt Lake City, Utah. Those are the streets of Salt Lake City, Utah in 2006. When I went out there, I spent most of my time in a rural community called Camas. You know, it's all the stereotypes of a rural community that is rapidly becoming a suburb. And Heber City, which just 5 years ago you could have called a farming community, and has a growth rate of about 2,000% and is now decidedly a suburb. In 2002, Utah hosted the Olympics, and that's what really brought in the Latino workforce and really changed the nature of the state in terms of infrastructure. They provided highways that allowed people to be able to commute from Park City, which is now like a big kind of playground for the super rich on a Mitt Romney land, over to Camas and Heber, where there's affordable housing and where huge numbers of Latinos now live. In Camas and Heber were not only completely all white just 7 or 8 years ago, they were also completely all Mormon. So when Latinos started coming in and looking for the Catholic Church and speaking Spanish, everybody was really kind of confused. It really kind of threw everything off. And the school principal there in Heber, wonderful guy, Eric Campbell, you know, he really faced some challenges. This white dude, you know, he's saying, you know, I don't know what to do. Not only was the achievement of Latino students really lagging, but there was really no social cohesion in the school. The kids weren't really even playing together, and this was in an elementary school. There was just not a lot of social cohesion, either in the larger community or in the school. And he'd hear rumblings around town that, you know, with people saying really negative things about Latinos, and he didn't like that. And so he was in a place where he needed to improve the achievement of Latino students, but also he wanted to do something more than that. He really wanted to create a more integrated environment. So then he started doing research, and what he found was that it really wasn't effective to have all the Latino kids shoved off and segregated in classrooms, teaching them English all day with a little bit of science with people who really didn't know how to speak Spanish. That the more effective method was something called two-way bilingual education, in which kids would come together, English-speaking kids and Spanish-speaking kids, and would learn part of the day in English and part of the day in Spanish. And he thought that this was a really good idea. And so he presented it to the community. And I said, well, what was the reaction? He said, well, there was a for sale sign on my lawn, and I did not put it there. But over time, people sort of warmed to the idea. Simultaneously, people in the state, really staunch Republicans, had gone on some sort of junket to China. And they all went to China, and they met Chinese school children who could speak beautiful English and, you know, beautiful Chinese, and were doing really well in school, and it freaked them out. And they said, oh my God, we're not going to be able to keep up with China. Our kids need to learn other languages. So they came back, and they decided that they were going to pass a law that created a grant program for schools across the state to start immersion programs. So this could be an immersion program in Chinese, or in German, or in Russian, or in Spanish. But the Spanish program was going to be different because of the intervention of many of the principals who were facing new immigration in their schools. They said, we don't want one of these one-way immersion programs where we just have a bunch of white kids learning Chinese. We want to bring the Latino students, we want to build on the strength of our Latino students, of our English language learners. We don't necessarily see them as a deficit. Somebody was talking before about how white kids need African American teachers. Well, the way that they saw the situation in Utah among the principals was that the white kids really needed to learn from the Latino students. And so they created a system of two-way bilingual programs. There's now 25 two-way bilingual programs, and they exist in the context of these larger language immersion schools. But the two-way programs are very different because they are focused specifically on equity, on social cohesion, and inclusion and integration. And I think I'm going to cut it short now because, Elaine, I don't want to be strangled. And I know I'm at 12, but I think that this quote really sums it up beautifully, and it's a good way to end, even though it's not where I want to end. Much of the talk in the education world about English language learners is all, oh, they need this, oh, they are such a challenge. But two-way turns all that on its head. It says, our Spanish speakers have skills and talents, and let's build with that. It says we all need to adjust to the 21st century. It's not this crazy idea anymore about them needing to adapt to us.
I started 34 years ago, actually more than that, as a teacher in the New York City public schools in the South Bronx. And then later, I moved to Westchester County to serve as an assistant principal and principal. And although I'm retired, I'm still very much involved in education and trying to make a difference in children's lives. This discussion is primarily about my experiences as a principal. All right, so I'm going to kind of move through this really quickly because it lays out what I wanted to cover as part of this discussion, and I may or may not be able to get to everything. Much of the discussion this morning was about the changing landscape of Westchester County, so we could probably move through those statistics and eliminate some of them because they're repetitive in terms of what was discussed this morning. But I want to talk to you about my experiences as a practitioner. And when you become a principal, you're handed a set of cards. You're handed a set of cards, and you really have to demonstrate leadership in addressing that set of cards that you've been dealt. So I'm going to share with you, talk to you about the school and how I really addressed the needs of children and families within a building that had very, very high level of minority children. 84% of those children were Latino children, and I can't tell you exactly, but I can tell you most likely that most of those children were from undocumented families. We grew a relationship over time with those families, so we knew what those issues were. In addition to that, the school that I was in, the Thomas Edison School in Port Chester, was located in the poorest side of town. And when you looked around, you saw small houses that were legally zoned for one or two families that had like 5, 6, 4, 8 families living together, literally taking turns sleeping on the sofa and on beds in the living room. I can tell you because I went to those homes. The strategy that I'm going to be focusing in on is whole child education and the community school as a way of organizing services around the needs of children and families. And we're going to talk about what works, programs and practices and services, and measuring success for children and schools beyond what is typically on a school report card or a data warehouse. And finally, I hope to get to what I think are some important next steps, things to think about. So I want to share with you, this is a free downloadable document. It's called Westchester by the Numbers. It's a 2008 publication, and it paints a picture of what children's lives are like in Westchester County. Westchester County has a household median income of $77,000, but it's got a lot of poor children. So there's a framework for this document that I think is really pertinent. We call it systems thinking. First, all children have the same basic needs, but they don't have the same resources, and they live with families that are, in many cases, in communities that are resource poor. The other thing is that children are affected or impacted by disparate but interdependent factors. Basically, what I'm talking about here is that you can have many significant adverse childhood experiences that will impact your life for years to come. The flip side of this is we can make a difference. We can make a difference by the programs, practices, services that we put in place to either ameliorate, decrease, eliminate some of these negative childhood experiences. And when I talk about children, I'm talking about children and youth under the 18 years of age and under. The other piece of this is the obvious, that children's well-being depends on the decisions and actions of adults, and that really reminds me of what Mr. Rebel talked about this morning, about all of the legal decisions that impact children's lives. And so there's been a changing landscape in Westchester County, and it really is a repetition of what I've heard this morning in terms of the breakdown. A significant number of Latino children and families are moving into Westchester County, significant percentage of Asian families as well. This is a much more diverse landscape than what it was 10 years ago. Here's a piece that wasn't mentioned. In Westchester County, from 1990 to 2000, the number of children under the age of 18 has increased by 20%. Now, we talked about the landscape this morning, but I want to reiterate something that was really said and said a number of times. That population is not so much evenly dispersed throughout our county. It's in concentrated pockets. So if you looked at the free lunch in Westchester County for elementary school children, I think it was from 2006, you're going to see Mount Vernon, Peekskill, White Plains, and Yonkers as among the townships or municipalities that have the highest concentration of children of color. But here's an important piece of the pie. We have more kids, but if you are a child in Westchester County of color, you are more likely, twice as likely to be poor. So the statistic is about 8.4% of the children in our county are considered living in poverty. That's having an income of less than $25,000 per year. However, it's twice that if you are a child of color. There's a disparity in access to resources, and I've just been given the look that I need to really move on. And I need to say that the supports that were in place, financial supports, nutritional supports, childcare supports, these supports are important, and they have diminished while the number of children that we're seeing in our county have grown. And so there's a challenge of responding systemically. That is the challenge that we see in our county now. Very quickly, and I thought of moving past this slide, but I'm not, because I want to talk a little bit about magnets. That magnet program, I was involved in two. One as an assistant principal and one as a principal. As an assistant principal in White Plains, we had controlled choice. We did achieve integration. There was a balance of populations in all of the schools. I will tell you, this really reminds me of Dr. Lasden Billings' comment. Once you get the children in the same building, you've got to work hard to make sure that they're integrated in terms of their relationships, in terms of having equity and access to programs of academic advancement and enrichment, and that they're not overclassified in special ed. Okay, here's the alternative approach. I could not change the housing zones. I could not change the income of the children. That was the hand that I was dealt. What I did with my staff and with the community involvement, we created a network of support moving from disparity to opportunity. Very quickly, I'm going to just move through the kinds of things that the community was talking about in terms of their needs. Childcare, after-school homework support, being better able to communicate with parents because this was primarily a Spanish-speaking community. I wanted to see better test scores. I wanted to be able to recruit quality teachers, and that's a hard thing when you have mostly poor minority children. And another key thing was access to health care. All right, I'm gonna move through this quickly. I just wanna say, it's Maslow 101. It's Maslow 101. That's what I was seeing in the school. So we built an organizational structure to meet all of the developmental needs of kids, the physical, the social, the emotional, the intellectual, the ethical, the civic competencies of kids. This is what the school looked like. It's a complex structure called the Community School Strategy, where we are integrating and co-locating, as much as is possible, resources within the building and making them easier for families to access. We had a healthcare center, and you can see the services listed that we provided. It would take too long to review each one. We had a community school that certainly was outcomes and standards driven. But I want to talk to you about developmentally appropriate, because it speaks to, Dr. Billings' comments earlier. Developmentally appropriate means that children are, their needs are being met in terms of their cognitive needs or their intellectual needs, in terms of their emotional needs, in terms of their physical needs, and even in terms of their cultural sensitivity needs. So I think those pieces are really important, and it's important beyond the standards. Relational engagement was a key part of what we did. So we really found ways to integrate the children in ways that they could have positive relationships with one another, a lot of character development, and family and community centered. You're giving me the science. I'm going to try to move really quickly. Cross-boundary leadership, a part of the community school strategies. People, stakeholders from the community gather together, and they bring resources to the building, but they require that you develop collaboration. It's once been called by Professor Shelley Wepner, who's here, entrepreneurial leadership. Accountability, and this part I'm gonna it's the most important, but I'm gonna kind of whiz through it. In the schools, we look at student achievement data a lot, but when you're in a community school, look at what else you look at. Climate indicators, family engagement indicators, professional development indicators, health and wellness indicators. All of these things become really a bigger part of accountability in schools. In terms of our academic performance, before the tests got longer and harder, and they decided to include more children in the testing pool, and the formats have changed, the school did extremely well. They, like other schools, struggle with the changes that have taken place. But you steer the course, folks. You don't abandon all of the wonderful things that are going on to support the whole child in order to have a competing priority be academics. They go hand in hand. And I do have to stop. Can I do just the last slide? Because I think it's important. All right. I'm going to get to it. And again, I apologize for the rush. Okay, here's the recommendations. And I'm going to step over. With regard to policy and funding, we need funding at all levels to allow for the flexible use of resources. so that we can devote the resources toward the education of the whole child. We need to use local, state, federal funds more flexibly. And we should have an expanded mission of what it is to educate the child. The other thing is we need to address the reality of the changing suburbs and provide equity in funding for those schools that have an urban profile in a suburban setting. In many cases, we've been cut out of special funding, competitive grants, simply because we are part of a wealthy county. We need to cultivate leaders at all levels to how to work in schools and with schools in comprehensive and integrated ways so they can successfully educate the increasing number of children and youth growing up in poverty. We need to build capacity and provide opportunity for business, education, and nonprofits to work collaboratively across systems to positively impact children, families, and their communities. And we need to create other community schools as part of the suburban landscape to address issues of disparity and to fulfill the promise of opportunity for minority and disadvantaged children and youth.
Well, first, the changing demographics of suburban communities really offer us, I think, a unique opportunity to create stable and integrated communities that are respectful, healthy places for all of our children. However, that's only going to be able to happen if we plan and we do it right. That's when we're going to have our suburban promise fulfilled. And what that means is that we have to be as committed to integrated classrooms as we are to integrated buildings. Second reason why I think tracking research is important is because we're seeing a resurgence of tracking now, a lot of it because of the test-based accountability systems. So we're seeing tracking happen again at the earliest levels in elementary schools with systems like called platooning, where kids are aligned and march to classes depending upon their test scores. And as you see these two things happening, you see our schools become more integrated in the suburbs, and then all of those pressures as well. It could even be, a heck of a lot worse than it is today. So to talk about tracking just briefly and why it matters for a conference like this is really to talk about its roots. The origins of tracking came at the beginning of the last century, when all of a sudden we had a wave of new immigrants coming into this country, and folks decided there needed to be a way to separate them from native-born American children. So you saw the rise of IQ testing, social Darwinism, with wonderful terms like laggards in our schools, and folks worrying about the great army of incapables. All of a sudden, a lot of that language appeared in that sorting. And then in the 1950s, sociologists like Talcott Parsons started to recognize that tracking was really replicating the social order. That rather than having kids getting caught up because they were in remedial tracks and low track classes, that all it was really doing was solidifying a lot of the problems. It also became very, very interesting in the era of desegregation, and the courts, the great liberal courts of the past, actually recognized very shrewdly that what was happening was as schools became integrated, they became resegregated internally due to tracking. And so that there were actually some court cases, the most famous being Hobson versus Hampson, which took place in Washington, D.C., where there was a judge who ruled that Brown v. Board also applied to in-school segregation, which resulted from the tracking by IQ scores. Unfortunately, then that decision was overturned and modified. However, it really kind of brought the issue forth, and then detracking became part of remedies for districts under desegregation orders in order to achieve unitary status, and Jeannie and Kevin Wellner were very important players in that and helping some of the schools detrack. Then in the 1980s, we're going to move back a little bit from some of that, really the serious questions about tracking and ability grouping were asked, thanks really in great part to a lot of Jeannie's work and her book on the same, Keeping Track. And we started to see from the research all of the damage that was being done. For example, we realized from research that no matter how schools decided to track, the same patterns of stratification by SES and by race were emerging. It didn't matter whether it was by test scores, it didn't matter whether it was by choice, it didn't matter whether it was flexible grouping, the same patterns emerged. And so the only real remedy or way to address this was to detrack and to level up. And researchers began to think about that in serious ways. And to also start to take a look at some of the research on achievement. And at the end of the day, what they found was that low track classes especially had a terrible effect on kids. It caused them to fall further and further behind, and that it just really was impossible to create what might be a positive low track environment. And then we started to see research on schools that detracked. And essentially, when you look at the meta-analyses, what you find is that in schools that are detracked, kids who would be considered to be of average achievement and high achievement, if it's done right, well, they do just fine. So one of the things that I did in the book was I tried to see if I couldn't update some of what was happening. And I studied a few districts and did some, I think, some very fascinating interviews with folks, both those from the past who had retired, as well as those who were present. One of them actually was a school district that we talked about earlier, which is Evanston Township. And it was really interesting listening to people and hearing their stories, all of them having made some progress or a lot of progress when it came to detracking. The first is the district where I'm from, Rockville Center, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. Woodland Hills was one of those districts that were under a court desegregation order and had to detrack in order to achieve unitary status. Stamford Public Schools, I think people are aware of. New England County High School, or Country High School rather, is a pseudonym for a school in Vermont. Sullins High School is a suburban school, and then of course Evanston Township High School. One of the things I found out, and it's probably not going to surprise anyone, is that the degree of resistance to detracking seemed to be in these places in direct proportion to the size of the black and brown student body. So that, for example, in New England Country School, there was hardly any resistance at all. There was some resistance around class, because even in that community, there was sort of the haves and the have-nots by socioeconomics, but it wasn't strong resistance. The strongest resistance seemed to happen in districts where there were sort of bimodal distributions in the populations. There's a lot of racial coding that happens now. People aren't maybe as obvious as they were in the past. For example, parents would come to board meetings in some of these districts and say things like, well, we don't want our kids in class with the kids that don't care, right? Or the kids whose parents don't care. And everybody knew, nobody would say it, but everybody knew what it meant. I can remember when we were doing our detracking at Southside, I once had a mom call me up, and we were detracking 10th grade, and she said to me, well, Carol, I thought this was the year we were going to weed those kids out. And I knew exactly what she meant. I played dumb and questioned her. I knew she wouldn't say it, but it's a subtext that's there. But I think, there is some good news. There has been some progress that's been made. And even in some of the places, with the exception of Woodland Hills, which after the court went away and the money went away, it totally retracted. In all of the other places, even when they had to stop, when the politics just got to be too bad, they didn't go backwards. And the hope then is that they'll move forward. So there is some good news, I think, that you can make some movement. we've been really lucky. Southside High School is a suburban community. It's 22% black or brown. We have everything from $1 million homes to kids that live in Section 8 housing, as well as federally subsidized housing. And it's been a journey, and it's been a journey of well over a decade. I work for an amazing superintendent who I love, who really has such a commitment to equity. And what we've seen is that it can work, and it can work well. And I know Amy has a film a little bit later that she's going to share with you. So that when we were back in the 1980s, things were very, very tense in the high school. There were times when the high school was actually shut down because of interracial fighting. And I have to tell you, as principals now, I mean, it's not even anything that I think about. Our kids are integrated in every possible way. For the first time this year, I'm really proud of this. We have all kids in International Baccalaureate English. So every kid taking the best curriculum that we have to offer. And it's been a gradual process that from first we did the 9th grade, and then the 10th grade, and then the 11th grade. And next year we're doing IB history for everybody. And it's been such a remarkable change where we leveled up very deliberately, made sure that our classes were heterogeneous, and also gave kids the support they needed. So we didn't run into that, oh, you're going to water everything down and my kid's going to lose. And it's interesting, nobody really even bats an eye each time we move it forward. When I took over as principal in the year 2000, if you looked at our Regents diploma rate, it was, how am I doing? Okay. It was actually pretty good, but there was a huge gap. Last year, for the first time, everybody graduated with a Regents diploma. There was no gap at all. And back in 2000, less than 15% of our Black and Latino students were in IB classes. In 2014, these are the kids that are actually taking the test. 88% of all of our Black and Latino students will be graduating with at least one IB test. It shouldn't say course, because the truth of the matter is they're all in IB English this year, so they're all in, at least in the course. And it's done a lot of wonderful things. Just to sort of sum up a little bit, so much of this is about beliefs. And it's a mindset, it's a gestalt, and tracking's not just mechanical, it's a way that you embrace diversity, it's a way that you say, I'm really, really glad that our school has the diversity of kids that it has. You start to see success as something that everybody can have, that it's not just a matter of your success, or my success depends on your failure. It's thinking, putting aside the idea of individual advantages and looking at comprehensive advantages, which really helps your community. The ones in our area that stuck with the tracks and tried to separate the kids, they're the communities that have experienced the greatest white flight. Rockville Center hasn't experienced any at all. It's forgetting all the stuff with the scores. I don't care about the scores. You look on your benchmarks and you look at your goals, like how many kids are in an IB program, how many kids are taking those courses that are really going to prepare them for college. And it's moving to a philosophy where you move away from sort and exclude to accept and include. And I really hope that we do think of this as promise in the suburbs, and that we work together to make sure that we do it right so that we don't repeat a lot of the errors of the past. Thank you.
That has been successful enough for long enough at working on integration and diversity, Oak Park, Illinois, that some people are kind of tired of hearing us talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. And the reason I think it's important to talk about this is for two reasons. One, I can talk to you about being integrated in a community for a long period of time. And secondly, I can show you how it's really our housing policy that we put in place in Oak Park that sustains the diversity in our school system, and how we've made some tweaks in both places to make sure we can continue to do that. But it's really important. So Oak Park is a diverse community. It's an integrated community. And those are different things, obviously. but we're both. And it wasn't always that way, and it didn't always look like it was going to be that way. In the time when Hemingway lived in Oak Park, he called Oak Park the community of small minds and broad lawns, and it really was, actually, at that point. Oak Park was not always this progressive wonderland that it kind of is known for in the Chicago region and some other places. And when in the census in 1970, Oak Park was an all-white community. It was 99% white. And what happened at that time, there were really three things that could have happened other than what did happen in Oak Park. One of the things that could have happened is it could have totally resegregated the same way the west side of Chicago did, which is immediately adjacent to Oak Park. It could have not changed at all because of hostility and real ways of trying to exclude folks from being in Oak Park, which was what a number of the suburbs that surrounded us did. Or it could have diversified and become segregated like the other diverse communities that are in Illinois. So a couple of them work a little bit towards integration as well, but nobody's really had the same concerted effort on integration and diversity that Oak Park has had. But what we ended up with was change over time that looks like this. Our population has, since the 1990 census, really become to be very reflective of what the regional population looks like as well, as far as percentages of our population. The one group that is underrepresented now is the Latino population, which is grown dramatically in the 2000 and 2010 census for the region, but hasn't quite grown that way in Oak Park. And this diversity that has changed over time has also been integrated along the way. And the way that we've been able to do that is Oak Park is 45% rental. And the organization that I work for helps people find apartments. So the fair housing work that we do is not fair housing work of, do you think you've been discriminated against? We'll try to file a complaint for you. The fair housing work that we do is, are you looking for a place to live? We will help you do that. And in that process, we're going to encourage you to move in a way that integrates our community or sustains the integration of our community if we already have places that you will just sort of repeat that integration for us. It's been extremely successful, and it's been proactive rather than reactive, which is why we can continue its success. And because it's happening in the rental market, it has another effect of making sure that when we work in the rental market, the homeownership market around it sort of follows that lead, right? That said, the rental market is a higher level of people of color than the homeownership market does in Oak Park. That's partly due to economics. But let me show you a little bit about the economics of Oak Park. This is what happened in Oak Park, and this is something else I want you to know can happen in diverse communities, and this is why I put it up here. The EAV is what is the equalized assessed value of our community. That's basically the value of all the taxable property in our community, right? I've got both the nominal EAV, what changed over time, just like in the dollars it was in that year, and then I standardized it to show, in 2010 dollars, what percentage of what we were valued in 2010 were we valued in each census period. And you can see we're a community that lost white population and got richer, okay? It can happen. And that's a really important lesson for people to see, because what the big issue was in Oak Park and what the big issue is in most of the places that I go to who want to learn about diversity is, how can we become diverse and not become super poor? And we say, well, it's possible. It can be done. And you can do that by recognizing that race and class, while they have a lot of intersections, are not one and the same. And you can do that by making sure that you put into place policies that are not only about working with poor people of color, but all people of color. And so that's a big part of how we were able to accomplish what we were able to accomplish. Now, that said, Oak Park also has a population of 52,000 people. We have 550 voucher holders in Oak Park. We have a couple of senior buildings that are for only low-income seniors in the building. We have a brand new 51-unit low-income housing development that we just put in town. It was sited in a way to make sure that it was in a wealthier part of town, though. And it's not as if people who are poor have absolutely no access to the community. We're trying to make sure that we're adjusting for that. But my organization works entirely on racial integration. And because we know that racial integration is a precursor for being able to build a coalition of folks who will see other benefits in the community, for whether it's income or, we're progressive on so many other things now because we have this reputation and we attract the right kind of people to our community. So consequently, Oak Park looks like this. It's a purplish kind of place. It's not red or blue. So the pink dots are white people. The black dots are African Americans. Yellow, orangish dots are Latinos, and the green dots are Asians. So those are the four major groups, and that's how we look at it. You can see how much more integrated Oak Park is than the communities that surround us, right? We have a community directly east of us, Austin and Chicago. That's the Chicago border on our north and our east. And it is a very poor, very African-American neighborhood. We have Berwyn and Cicero, which are the places over the last 20 years that have been the part of the western suburbs of Cook County where Latinos have moved to, and white flight happened almost immediately. And then we have to our northwest, River Forest and Elmwood Park. Elmwood Park is an old sort of Italian, Polish town that has been very resistant to people of color moving in. And River Forest is a very wealthy, very white community that actually is sort of tied to Oak Park in that we share a high school. And that has somewhat followed with our policies, but not quite to the same activity. The thing you'll notice is it's not perfect. I've said a number of times before that we're not perfect, but we're trying harder than almost everybody else to be perfect. And so you can see that there is a little bit more blue to the east and a little bit more pink to the west. And so we have 8 elementary school systems in Oak Park. It's 52,000 people. We have a very active school system. It's doing very well. We used to have 10. They were K through 8. We got rid of 2 of them and made our schools K through 5 and then added 2 middle schools. All of the elementary schools have neighborhood boundaries that they can draw from so that they have a fairly integrated or very well integrated population. None of them are, really, really white or really, really black or really, really anything. They all have a pretty good integration within them. And then to continue that same process, the 2 middle schools gather in a way from the elementary schools that will promote even more integration. So the schools that catch in the northwest part of Oak Park and the schools that catch in the southeast part of Oak Park go to one middle school, and then southwest and northeast go to another middle school. Very intentional. We demolished and rebuilt buildings and redrew boundaries and did all that kind of thing in order to make sure that we would have an integrated school system. And then we only have one high school. So it's 4,000 students there. It's a big school. But you know what? Because it's 4,000 students, we have everything you could think of to offer. And we've finally clawed our way back into the top 20 schools in Illinois. And we were down in the low 20s for a while there. And the old folks in Oak Park will always remind us how we used to be in the top 5. But it's working its way back up again, and that has to do a lot with a community dialogue around what is our school, how are we going to make our schools more successful, and why does that need to focus on the folks who are doing the worst? And we have an achievement gap in Oak Park, and we're finally, there's my 10 minutes, we're finally doing a lot on that. We're doing the whole community. Oh, I get 2 more minutes, great. I must have been ahead. So we have 2 things that are happening right now. One is we have an early childhood collaboration that's been put together that 3 different governmental entities supported. So every kid in our town, every single one of them is going to be tracked from until they go to kindergarten through the early childhood experience. And then we have another effort that we're putting together called the Success of All Youth, which is taking the kids from kindergarten through high school and actually making sure that they're ready for post-high school, whether it's college, whether it's whatever, to make sure that we're addressing that gap and doing the best things that we can to put the right kind of equity strategies into place. All that is because, and this is how the Housing Center sees things, and we're starting to convince the whole community this is the way they should look at it too. We have a pyramid of progress in Oak Park that we've made our way part of the way up, and we haven't made all the way up, and we're still working at every level. But we have created a diverse community by marketing the community to people of all races and making sure that they all find Oak Park a desirable place to live. We then, in that process of helping them find a place to live, make sure that they sustain our integration. That sustains the integration of our, not only our school systems, but our social networks, our civic engagement. Even though we have this town of 52,000 people, our people are, everybody who's elected in Oak Park is elected at large. We don't have wards or districts or anything like that. And that would be antithetical to the way we would want to be. We then want to make sure that everybody's being included in all those networks and citizen commissions and elected boards and all those sorts of things, to the hope that at some point we will have full equity for everyone and that everybody will share in that prosperity. So that's it in a nutshell. My time is up. If you want to talk to me anymore, here's my email address right there. And we have websites that are both policy and sort of activity oriented. So
I'm going to, like a Baptist preacher, modify my presentation because I want to drive home this point about why I entitled the talk Beyond the Academic. So I'm going to give you a couple of anecdotes, and then I'm going to rush through this PowerPoint, which you can probably see the coordinators of this event and get a copy of if you so desire. Point number one, I'm married to a program officer that works for a foundation that works at the intersection of these types of critical issues, vulnerable young people and systems that work with those young people, human services, criminal justice, and public education. She has a blog on the Huffington Post. She's probably someone some of you would want to know to get some money to do some research. And yet in the community where we live, despite her having a master's degree from MIT in urban planning from the same institution where Professor Xavier Briggs teaches, 1 out of 4 families in our community live in poverty. 3 of our 7 schools in our school district are considered failing by the state. So she's well connected with the academic, but because of me, there's some action. Number 2, if you go to those failing schools in Norristown, because of the policies of our current governor, Tom Corbett, when a school is declared failing because of its standards on the PSSA, you can go to another school in another jurisdiction. But it's hard to go there if you live where you live because you cannot afford to live in another jurisdiction, and all of the adjacent school districts, fragmented in the same way we saw in Nassau County, actually prohibit that type of porting. So if you wanted to go to another school, you might have to go 2 or 3 jurisdictions over to a wealthy school, something you simply could not afford to do. Finally, what I want you to understand is how we got to Building One Pennsylvania is that in the work that we were doing, one of the major partners we had, Professor Briggs talked about the difference between partnership and coalition building. One of the major organizations we worked with was Good Schools Pennsylvania, which literally reinvented itself from being a school advocacy only organization into being a statewide equity, mobility, and sustainability organization, which is one of the primary reasons we have Building One PA. I tell you these things because I think it's important today that you don't just leave here with more information about what we already knew probably within the first half hour we were here, but that you learn that with all of these fancy degrees, and I have some, I went to Morehouse and Harvard, with all of this intellect, one of my colleagues joked at my recreational reading that are brought on the train, which are 2 books of theology by distinguished British theologians, that won't preach on Sunday when my folks come in and need encouragement because their school is failing or because they can't take their Section 8 voucher to anywhere but the poorest neighborhoods in the suburbs. So today we want to talk about how through community organizing you can recognize one of the biggest things that you in education need to do is build coalitions with people that want equity in the community. Maybe their equity interests are housing. Maybe their equity interest is small business development. Maybe their equity interest is public safety. But an improved community invariably, as we've heard from these other speakers, will improve educational outcomes. And so the history here of Building 1 Pennsylvania is we started working in older suburbs in southeastern Pennsylvania and mainly organized local leaders, school officials, clergy, and civic leaders. We wanted to build influence to affect policies, state and federal, to stabilize our communities. What you've already heard by hearing many of the Nassau County examples is the suburbs are much more fragmented. So if you meet a struggling suburban school district or a struggling suburban municipality or township, they don't have the kind of influence in Albany or Harrisburg or Annapolis that a big city has. And that's why so many of these debates often are wrongly bifurcated with big cities on one side that are considered black, urban, and poor, and suburbs on the other side that are misidentified as simply wealthy and white. Not only that, as we began to work together, we won a school funding formula to drive state aid based on property tax burden, tax base, and student poverty. But even when you do that, even when you help my school district in Norristown get more money, they're invariably going to need more money year after year after year when 1 out of 2 housing choice vouchers in the wealthiest county in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, 1 out of 2, are used in the 3.2 square miles of Norristown. So when you literally have a housing policy that makes the school district poor, then you've got to address housing policy as education policy. So a part of organizing, and to give you the 60-second training, I encourage any of you to engage in training from leading organizations like Building One America. If you want to learn how to take this important intellectual work and make it actually come up out the ground, that we learn about cutting issues. How are we going to tackle this? It's not enough, and I am a pastor, to appeal to people's hearts and minds. I've had to learn to work with people who may not like me or like what I believe, but we both have an interest in getting something done. We do a power analysis. Who are the people that need to be moved? It's often not the principal or the school superintendent that needs to be shouted at. It may be the mayor who may in fact appoint people to the school board. It may be the governor who's negotiating a deal to take over the failing school district, even in the suburbs, that has to be the target of your action. So you identify who are you going after that'll move you to get what you want, and you recruit allies. Yes, you're an education expert, but as we heard from one of the speakers, thank you, as we heard from one of the speakers, you may find allies in social services. You may find allies in healthcare. You may find allies with people who care about the same people you care about. So what we did is decided to target HUD and to take on this housing choice voucher program, recognizing that your opportunity cannot be dictated, nor should it be defined by your zip code. And that if you truly have mobility, one of the ways you can improve educational outcomes is actually have the opportunity to live in those places with high educational outcomes. Now I'm going to show you a map. You may not be able to see this very well, but the bottom line here is that the central city has the lowest amount of opportunity. It's red. But then there are minimum opportunity communities. All those communities would be considered inner ring suburbs around the red area, which is Philadelphia. And my community is one of those orange areas. But you see, most of the orange areas are clustered together. And then in contrast, the dark green are the highest opportunities. And what you don't know about Philadelphia, and I'll see if I can point here, this green area is what they call the main line. Now, the main line will have a few specks of color out there, and what I learned as a preacher is there are a few black Baptist churches along the main line because the domestics had to have somewhere to live so they could, praise God and then go clean the good white folks' houses. But they can't go to school there, right? And increasingly today, they do not live there. And so, as you can see here, many low opportunity communities with struggling school districts also have housing choice vouchers that are used there. On the other hand, none of the green areas, some of the best school districts in Metro Philadelphia, have anyone that needs housing assistance living in their communities. In the same way, we see the number of children in poverty disproportionately in the low opportunity, minimum opportunity towns and not in the high opportunity. As we engaged in this campaign, we joined in and drew in members of Congress. And I will add here, we drew in members from both sides. One of the earliest letters of support for housing choice voucher reform was a Republican Senator, Jim Gerlach, in the state of Pennsylvania. And we also ended up working with United States Senator Casey as well, because we couldn't just make this a partisan issue. It's not a partisan issue, it's a people issue. We have permanent interests, not partisan interests. Can I get an amen? All right. And so in the course of this campaign, we did things like public meetings, turned out people, recruited people, put pressure on people. And when they didn't initially move, we had to escalate. So when we couldn't get the regional administrator who covers Pennsylvania and Delaware to do what we wanted to do, we ultimately had to go all the way to the secretary. And so you can see here, I'm moving quickly. We went to the assistant secretary, and I had to remind him when John Transvenia sat with me and talked about being at Harvard that I went to Harvard too, and just because I live in Norristown doesn't mean you're going to disrespect me or my community. And so we continued to escalate, finally met with the U.S. secretary and gathered a statewide meeting of almost 1,000 people and said, will you commit to a model of housing mobility? The secretary said he would. Now, at an end-of-the-year event in 2011, the deputy secretary came and said, I want to bring you a check. But of course, you all know about these check analogies if you follow Baptist preachers and civic engagement. One happened to say in 1963 on the mall in Washington that we came to cash a check that's been returned, insufficient funds. And so just like in that instance, we saw that HUD made a promise and wanted a photo op, but there was no money behind it. So we had to keep them, press against them to have them keep their commitment. And we continued to do that, right? Not just at that point, we needed no more policy position papers. We needed no more extra footnotes. We needed no more conferences on the problem. We needed to keep the pressure on people with power to make them act. And finally, we had a break. They began to move forward, and we got a $500,000 commitment to start a housing mobility program in our region. And what is important is that these programs, even as Rob has talked about Chicago and Cook County in that region, Chicagoland, Baltimore, even Westchester have tried to move in this direction through litigation. And we've even heard that recommended here. Well, litigation takes a long time and it costs a lot of money. Money and time that you could be using to help people that you're here to learn about how to help today. So we're still in this fight because even in my community, a community where we have a Democratic administration that ought to be in line with the Obama administration, they're the ones dragging their feet the slowest to implement this regional policy of opportunity. We do now know indeed that it's not necessarily race, though it still is. It's space that dictates opportunity. Opportunity for quality schools, opportunity for safe and livable communities, opportunity for access not just to services, but access to a good job. We have people that live in Norristown that take an hour and a half to get to work because the jobs and what they can afford to live are not together. And you're going to find as you begin to address these issues in education, if you can do this kind of power analysis and build these kind of coalitions, you can experience success from the ground up. Thank you.
So this is to Carol Burris. What are the benefits that your students have obtained from IB curriculum compared with advanced placement? And what are the distinguished differences between IB and AP in terms of student overall performance or learning experience?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of IB, and I always, I wasn't always. I think the difference that I see between the two programs is that AP and the AP are tests. They're really test-driven, and it's almost about trying to figure out what the kid doesn't know, whereas IB is really about finding out what kids do know. It's much more scaffolded. I think it's much more accessible for all kids. It's very committed to multicultural values. And a lot of the assessments are embedded in the course, builds on multiple intelligences. There are oral presentations that the kids have to do. I think you can do what we did with AP, but I think it's much more difficult. But the outcome from IB is extraordinary. And we know that our kids, that's why we've been getting everybody into the program. We know when they come back, and from follow-up 4-year studies that we do, their outcomes in terms of college graduation and just success and transition into college is great from IB.
Thank you. And I have to put in a plug. There is a documentary on the website, on my website, eraseracismny.org, Tale of Two Schools, Race and Education on Long Island. And Rockville Center is one of the schools, and you'll know immediately which school it is. And this is a question for Rob. How did you go from 99% white to having a utopian community where there is a more equitable trajectory than anywhere else in America? How have you addressed barriers of fear, advantage, siloed thinking, et cetera? Specifically, how did you get public will to agree with this pathway?
You wrote that question. I was just going to ask if Phil wrote that question, but no, it happened gradually over time, but the original impetus in 1972, which was what got the housing center started, is really about a community coming together about an issue. I'll do this as quickly as I can, but if you can step back all the way to 1950 when our first sort of prominent, at least maybe the first, but certainly the first prominent African-American homeowner in Oak Park, a guy by the name of Percy Julian, who was a genius with many patents to his name. I'm sure many people in here know who he is. About half the stuff in town is named after him at this point. And he moved, and somebody tried to firebomb his home. And luckily, they were very inept at firebombing. They didn't know how to light something, whatever, dynamite, whatever it was that they tried to use. And the community rallied to his defense and said, this guy deserves to be able to live here. That was 1950, and then really nothing much actively happened again until the late 1960s when the community could see what was happening in Chicago, and they saw how blockbusting and panic peddling were just destroying the West Side as far as the value that was there. The people who were moving in were perfectly fine, but the way it was being done was not good for anyone. And they didn't want that happening in Oak Park, but they didn't want to be hostile, so they had to come up with a solution. And so a lot of people at one particular time with a real urgency at that point tried to figure out what to do. But then over time, we've honed it, improved it, and gotten out of silos and into systems and those kinds of things. So it's a long story, and I'm always happy to talk to people on the phone about it or via email. And I don't want to take everybody else's time, though.